Little black girl said you look like my daddy in heaven, and the Millionaire CEO couldn't stop crying. The elevator climbed 47 floors in silence, each passing number on the digital display marking another second closer to what Alexander Pierce knew would be the most important meeting of his career. His reflection stared back from the polished steel doors, sharp suit, sharper eyes, and a jaw set like concrete. At 52, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had never lost a battle he cared about winning. But today felt different. The doors slid open to reveal the executive floor of Pierce Tech Industries, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of downtown Chicago. Alexander's assistant, Monica, was already waiting with her tablet, and that particular expression she wore when delivering bad news wrapped in professional courtesy. The Jensen Group increased their stake to 12% overnight, she said without preamble, falling into step beside him. They're calling for a complete leadership review. Alexander's stride never faltered as they passed the portraits of Pierce Tech's previous CEOs, his grandfather, his father, and soon, if the activist investors had their way, someone who wasn't a Pierce at all. Let me guess. They want us to become a charity. They're using words like corporate responsibility and stakeholder capitalism, Monica replied, pulling up emails on her tablet. The Wall Street Journal is running a piece tomorrow about tech companies and social impact. We're not mentioned favorably. They entered his corner office, a monument to efficient power with its minimalist design and strategic awards placement. Alexander had learned long ago that sentiment was expensive. Every family photo, every personal touch was real estate that could be better used for quarterly reports or market analyses. Sir? Monica hesitated at the door. There's something else. Sarah from PR is here with the team. They have a proposal. Before Alexander could respond, Sarah Chin burst through the door with the kind of manic energy that usually preceded either brilliant ideas or career-ending disasters. Behind her trailed two junior associates clutching tablets, and looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Alex, we need to talk, Sarah said, dispensing with formalities. In her mid-30s with streaks of premature gray that she claimed made her look strategically experienced. Sarah was the only person in the company who dared to use his first name. She'd also increased Pierce Tech's public approval rating by 30% in 2 years, which bought her considerable latitude. The Jensen Group meeting is in 3 hours, Alexander said, settling behind his desk. Whatever this is exactly about the Jensen Group. Sarah dropped into the chair across from him. They're not just questioning our profits anymore. They're questioning our soul. Alexander almost smiled. I wasn't aware we had one. That's the problem. Sarah leaned forward. Look, I know your grandfather built this company on the principle that business is battle and sentiment is weakness. But times have changed. Investors want to feel good about their money now. They want stories. I don't deal in stories. I deal in results. Results don't matter if the narrative is that you're a corporate villain. Sarah gestured to her tablet. We've run the numbers. Your approval rating among key demographics is somewhere between used car salesmen and leaders during election season. One of the junior associates, Alexander thought his name was Brad or Brett, cleared his throat nervously. Sir, with respect, the market research shows that consumers increasingly want to support companies with clear social missions. Even B2B clients are factoring corporate responsibility into their vendor selection. Alexander studied the young man with the detached interest of a scientist observing a particularly naive lab specimen. And you believe the solution is what, exactly? Community gardens? Recycling initiatives? Actually, Sarah said, sliding a folder across his desk, we think the solution is Riverside Children's Hospital. Alexander opened the folder to find photographs of a modest medical facility on Chicago's South Side. He recognized it. Pierce Tech had been donating to the hospital for 8 years, though he'd never personally overseen the charitable giving. That was Monica's department, a line item that appeared on quarterly reports as community investment. We give them what, $50,000 a year? He asked. 75. Monica corrected from her position by the door. It's been the same amount since 2016. Sarah's grin widened. Here's the beautiful part. In 8 years, you've never actually visited. Not once. The CEO of their primary corporate sponsor has never shaken a single hand or taken a single photo. From a PR perspective, it's a goldmine of untapped potential. Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach. You want me to go to a children's hospital? For photographs. I want you to go to a children's hospital to show that Alexander Pierce cares about more than quarterly earnings, Sarah said. 1 visit, maybe 2 hours maximum. You read to some kids, you talk to some doctors, we get some beautiful photos of you looking compassionate and engaged. The Jensen Group sees that coverage, they remember that Pierce Tech has a heart, and suddenly their leadership review doesn't look so appealing to other shareholders. The room fell silent except for the distant hum of Chicago traffic 47 floors below. Alexander had built his reputation on making hard decisions quickly, but something about this felt different. Messier. Sir? Monica's voice was carefully neutral. The hospital's administrator, Dr. Rebecca Torres, has been hoping for a chance to meet with you. She's called several times over the years. Probably wants more money. Alexander muttered, though he found himself studying the photos more carefully. The building looked tired but clean, the kind of place that survived on dedication rather than resources. Sarah sensed an opening. Alex, I know this isn't your usual style. But sometimes the best business decision is the one that doesn't feel like business at all. Alexander closed the folder and looked at his watch. 2 hours and 43 minutes until the Jensen Group meeting. 2 hours and 43 minutes to decide whether Pierce Tech Industries would continue to be the company his grandfather had envisioned, or become something else entirely. 1 visit, he said finally. 2 hours maximum. And I want guarantees that this stays professional. No exploitation of sick children for corporate gain. Sarah's smile could have powered the building. Absolutely. Professional, tasteful, authentic. The car will be ready in 30 minutes. As his team filed out, chattering excitedly about logistics and photo angles, Alexander found himself alone with his reflection in the window. Somewhere in the city below, a children's hospital continued its work, unaware that their afternoon was about to change. And somewhere deeper than he cared to examine, Alexander Pierce wondered if his was about to change as well. The elevator ride down felt faster than the trip up, as if gravity itself was eager to pull him away from the sterile safety of the executive floor and into something far less predictable. By the time the black sedan pulled away from Pierce Tech's downtown headquarters, Alexander had already mentally rehearsed a dozen exit strategies. He had no way of knowing that in less than 2 hours, a little girl with wise eyes and a broken heart would mistake him for someone he'd never been, and ask him to become someone he'd never imagined. The sedan turned south, carrying Alexander Pierce toward Riverside Children's Hospital, and a reckoning 20 years in the making. Riverside Children's Hospital smelled like antiseptic and hope, a combination that made Alexander's chest tighten in ways he couldn't explain. Dr. Rebecca Torres, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and tired shoulders, met them at the main entrance with barely contained excitement. Mr. Pierce, this is such an honor, she said, shaking his hand with both of hers. We've been hoping for this day for years. Alexander nodded politely while Sarah's photographer discreetly captured the moment. The hospital was smaller than he'd expected, clean but clearly struggling, with outdated equipment visible through open doorways and paint that had seen better decades. We'd love to show you our new pediatric wing, Dr. Torres continued as they walked down a hallway lined with children's artwork. The donation from Pierce Tech helped us renovate the entire 3rd floor. Renovation was generous. Alexander noted the fresh paint over old walls, the mismatched furniture, the way staff members smiled too brightly while their eyes revealed exhaustion. Still, there was something warm here, something his sterile office building lacked entirely. They passed the playroom where a handful of children sat in wheelchairs or dragged 4 poles behind them like reluctant pets. Some waved shyly. Others stared with the solemn intensity that serious illness brings to young faces. If you wouldn't mind, Dr. Torres said, pausing near a room at the end of the hall. There's someone special I'd like you to meet. Janie's been here for 3 weeks now, and she could use some cheering up. Alexander glanced at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. This was exactly the kind of moment they'd come for, authentic human connection, captured on camera, shared with the world. The room was painted soft yellow with clouds stenciled on the ceiling. A small black girl, maybe 8 years old, sat propped up in bed surrounded by coloring books and stuffed animals. And 4 lines snaked from her thin arm to a pole beside the bed. She looked up as they entered, and Alexander felt something shift in his chest. Her eyes were enormous, dark and intelligent, with that particular brightness that seemed to see right through pretense. She studied Alexander for a long moment, her head tilted slightly, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Daddy? You came back?" The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. Sarah stepped forward quickly, probably thinking the child was confused by medication, but the girl's gaze never wavered from Alexander's face. "I knew you would," Janie continued, her voice growing stronger. "Mommy said you were watching from heaven, but I knew you'd come visit me." Dr. Torres immediately moved toward the bed, her expression shifting to professional concern. "Janie, sweetheart, this is Mr. Pierce. He's here too." "I know who he is," Janie said simply, reaching out her small hand toward Alexander. "He's my daddy." Alexander found himself frozen, unable to process what was happening. The rational part of his mind catalogued possibilities: medication effects, psychological trauma, simple confusion. But something in the girl's certainty made his throat close up. A nurse appeared in the doorway, alerted by the commotion. Dr. Torres spoke to her in low, urgent tones while Sarah grabbed Alexander's arm. "We should go," Sarah whispered. "This is obviously a misunderstanding." But Alexander couldn't move. Janie was still watching him with those impossibly bright eyes, still holding out her hand with complete faith that he would take it. "Mr. Pierce?" Dr. Torres returned, her voice carefully professional. "Perhaps we could speak privately for a moment?" They stepped into the hallway, leaving Janie with the nurse, who began checking her chart with practiced efficiency. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Torres began. "Janie lost her father 2 years ago. Malcolm Davis. He worked for your company, actually. Lost his job during the restructuring in 2022. The name hit Alexander like ice water. Malcolm Davis. Engineer, 3rd floor, Systems Division. He remembered signing the termination paperwork, remembered the cost savings projections, remembered absolutely nothing about the man behind the name. Malcolm was a single father," Dr. Torres continued, her voice growing quieter. "Brilliant engineer, devoted dad. After he lost his job, he struggled to find work. Fell into depression. His health insurance ran out, and when he had chest pains, he didn't seek treatment. Couldn't afford it." Alexander's hands went cold. "He died? Heart attack. Janie was 6. Dr. Torres glanced back toward the room. "She's been in and out of hospital since then. Leukemia. Her grandmother brought her here last month when she relapsed." Sarah was pulling at his sleeve now, whispering about leaving, about damage control, about how this wasn't the story they'd come to tell. But Alexander couldn't process her words over the roaring in his ears. "There's something else," Dr. Torres said softly. "Janie draws pictures of her father. She says he visits her in dreams. The resemblance, it's remarkable." The Jensen Group meeting was a disaster. Alexander sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, watching PowerPoint slides flash by. Profit margins, growth projections, market share analysis, while Janie's voice echoed in his mind like a song he couldn't turn off. "Daddy? You came back? Mr. Pierce?" David Jensen's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. "We asked about your strategy for addressing the public perception issues." Alexander blinked, realizing he'd been staring at his hands for the past minute. Around the table, 12 of Pierce Techa's largest investors watched him with expressions ranging from concern to calculation. "Our strategy," Alexander said slowly, "involves examining the human cost of our business decisions. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah, seated against the wall with other advisors, looked like she was planning his funeral. Jensen leaned forward. The human cost? Mr. Pierce, we're here to discuss returns on investment, not social philosophy. But Alexander was already standing, already walking toward the door. Gentlemen, I need to review some files. We'll reconvene tomorrow. He left behind a room full of angry millionaires and headed straight for HR. The personnel files were kept in a secure basement archive that Alexander had never bothered to visit. Monica found him there at midnight, surrounded by cardboard boxes and manila folders, his tie long discarded. Sir? Building security said you were down here. Alexander didn't look up from the file in his hands. Sarah Chin, systems engineer, terminated March 2022. Single mother of 2. Monica, how many people did we lay off in the 2022 restructuring? 437. She answered without hesitation. And how many of those had families? I don't have those statistics readily available. Alexander pulled another file. Robert Martinez, Quality Assurance, 15 years with the company. Diabetic. Health insurance terminated with employment. Get them. All of them. I want to know what happened to every single person we let go. Monica's tablet chimed softly as she made notes. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, what brought this on? Alexander finally looked up. Do you remember Malcolm Davis? Vaguely. Systems division. Good worker, I think. He died, Monica. Heart attack. Couldn't afford treatment after we cut his insurance. Alexander's voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. His daughter thinks I'm his ghost. By dawn, Alexander had read through 43 files. The pattern was always the same. Dedicated employees, many with families, discarded the moment they became inconvenient to quarterly profits. Some had found new jobs. Others hadn't. A few, like Malcolm, hadn't survived the transition. Sitting in his empty office as the sun rose over Chicago, Alexander found himself thinking about his own father. Not Richard Pierce, the CEO whose portrait hung in the hallway, but Tommy Kowalski, the factory worker who'd abandoned them when Alexander was 8. His mother had scrubbed floors at 3 different office buildings to keep food on the table. Alexander had sworn he'd never be that vulnerable again, never depend on anyone else's mercy for survival. But somehow, in building his fortress of success, he'd become the man with the power to decide who got abandoned. His phone buzzed. Sarah, probably panicking about the Jensen meeting. Instead, he called the hospital. You came back, Janie said when he appeared in her doorway that afternoon. No cameras this time, no PR team, just Alexander with a book tucked under his arm. Dr. Torres had intercepted him at the nurse's station, explaining in hushed tones that they were still debating how to handle the situation. Some staff thought they should tell Janie the truth. Others worried it might damage her fragile emotional state. What's that? Janie asked, pointing to the book. It's about space, Alexander said, settling into the chair beside her bed. Stars and planets and rocket ships. Janie's eyes lit up. Daddy loved space. He used to tell me stories about astronauts who visited different worlds. Alexander opened the book, his hands shaking slightly. Would you like me to read you one? For the next hour, he read about distant galaxies and brave explorers while Janie listened with rapt attention. She asked questions, smart questions that reminded him painfully of her father's engineering reports. Mr. Pierce? Dr. Torres appeared in the doorway. Could I speak with you? They stepped into the hallway where she handed him a folder. These are Malcolm's employment records. I thought you should see them. Alexander read through commendations, performance reviews, peer evaluations. Malcolm Davis hadn't just been a good employee, he'd been exceptional. Team player. Problem solver. The kind of person who stayed late to help colleagues, who brought donuts for the office, who'd invented a software patch that saved the company $2 million. He was going to be promoted, Dr. Torres said quietly. Senior systems engineer. The paperwork was on his supervisor's desk the day the layoffs were announced. Alexander closed the folder, feeling something fundamental crack inside his chest. Who decided which employees to cut? According to the records, those decisions came directly from executive level. Budget optimization, I think they called it. The emergency board meeting was called for Friday morning. Alexander knew it was coming. Too many whispered conversations had stopped when he entered rooms. Too many concerned glances had been exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. He arrived to find the 12 board members already seated, their faces arranged in expressions of polite concern that barely masked their intent. Richard Blackwood, the board chairman and his father's oldest friend, cleared his throat. "Alex, we need to discuss your recent behavioral changes." "My behavioral changes?" Alexander took his seat at the head of the table, noting how the others seemed to lean away from him. "Your performance in the Jensen meeting was concerning," said Helen Martinez, VP of Operations. "Walking out on major investors sends a message we can't afford. And then there are these hospital visits," added Thomas Wright, Chief Financial Officer. "Security reports show you've been there 4 times in the past week. Alone. Without PR oversight." Alexander studied their faces. People he'd worked with for years, people who'd built fortunes on his leadership. "Are you questioning my judgment?" "We're questioning your priorities," Blackwood said bluntly. "The Jensen Group is threatening a hostile takeover. Stock prices are volatile. And instead of focusing on damage control, you're playing nursemaid to sick children." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Alexander felt something cold and final settle in his chest. "Motion to call for a leadership review," Wright announced. "All in favor?" 11 hands rose. Only Alexander's remained on the table. "You have until Monday to convince us you're still the CEO this company needs," Blackwood said. "Otherwise, we'll be selecting your replacement." Alexander found Janie in the hospital garden that afternoon, sitting in a wheelchair beside a small fountain. Her grandmother, a dignified woman named Rose, sat on a nearby bench knitting what looked like a scarf. "Daddy!" Janie's face lit up when she saw him. "Look, they let me come outside today." Alexander approached slowly, aware that every visit made the eventual truth more painful. "How are you feeling?" "Better. The doctors say my numbers are good." She reached for his hand with the automatic trust of a child who never learned to doubt. "Daddy, can I ask you something?" "Of course." Janie's voice grew smaller, uncertain. "Why did you leave us?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. He glanced at Rose, who was watching with knowing eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom and pain. "I mean," Janie continued, tears starting to gather, "I know you had to go to heaven. But why didn't you say goodbye? Mommy cried for a really long time, and I kept waiting for you to come home." Alexander knelt beside her wheelchair, his throat closing. Here was the question he'd been dreading, the one that cut straight to the heart of everything he'd done wrong. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people make choices that hurt the ones they love most. Not because they want to, but because they think they have to. But you loved us, right? Even when you had to leave?" "Yes," Alexander whispered, and for the first time in years, he wasn't calculating the cost of his words. "More than anything." Janie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I forgave you a long time ago. I just wanted to tell you." That night, Alexander sat in his home office overlooking Lake Michigan, staring at a blank document on his laptop screen. His penthouse apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a billionaire CEO, sleek, expensive, and utterly empty of anything that mattered. For 20 years, he built his life around avoiding becoming his father, the man who'd abandoned his family when things got tough. But sitting there in his perfect isolation, Alexander realized he'd become something worse. He hadn't just abandoned one family, he'd systematically destroyed hundreds of them. Malcolm Davis had been a good man trying to provide for his daughter. Like Alexander's own mother, working 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Like every parent who'd ever lost sleep wondering how to pay for medicine or rent or hope itself. Alexander began to type. Pierce Tech Industries Corporate Responsibility Initiative. He wrote about employee retraining programs, expanded healthcare coverage, mental health support for laid-off workers. He wrote about profit sharing and family assistance funds. He wrote about the kind of company Malcolm Davis deserved to work for, the kind Janie deserved to inherit. By dawn, he had a 40-page proposal that would cost Pierce Tech approximately $200 million in the first year alone. It would slash executive bonuses, redirect shareholder dividends, and fundamentally transform how the company operated. It would also almost certainly cost him his job. Alexander printed the document, put it in his briefcase, and drove to the hospital one last time before the Monday board meeting. He found Janie sleeping, her small hand curled around a new drawing, another stick figure man, but this one was kneeling beside a smaller figure, both of them smiling. "She's been working on that all morning," Rose said quietly from her chair beside the bed. "Says it's her daddy learning how to be different." Alexander studied the drawing, seeing something in those simple crayon lines that all his business degrees had never taught him. Sometimes the most profitable thing a person could do was learn how to lose the right things. The annual shareholders' summit was held at the Chicago Marriott, a gleaming hotel that had hosted Pierce Tech's meetings for 15 years. Alexander stood backstage, listening to the murmur of 800 investors filling the ballroom beyond the curtain. His speech sat in his jacket pocket, not the safe, profit-focused presentation his board expected, but something else entirely. Sarah appeared at his elbow, tablet in hand, looking like she hadn't slept in days. "Alex, please tell me you're not about to do anything dramatic." The Jensen Group brought reporters. Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, they're all here. Alexander adjusted his tie, thinking of Janie's drawing tucked in his briefcase. "Define dramatic." "Anything that isn't quarterly projections and growth strategies," Sarah said desperately. "The board is already nervous after Friday's meeting. They're looking for any excuse to." "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Alexander Pierce, CEO of Pierce Tech Industries." The applause was polite but measured as Alexander walked onto the stage. 800 faces looked up at him expectantly: pension fund managers, institutional investors, hedge fund executives. People who measured success in basis points and quarterly returns. Alexander had given this same speech, with minor variations, for 12 years. He knew exactly what they wanted to hear: growth, efficiency, shareholder value maximization. Instead, he pulled out the wrong speech. 4 days ago, he began, "I met a little girl named Janie Davis. She's 8 years old, fighting leukemia, and she believes I'm the ghost of her father visiting from heaven." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. In the front row, Blackwood's face had gone pale. "Her father was Malcolm Davis, a Pierce Tech engineer whom I personally terminated in 2022 to improve our quarterly margins. Malcolm was about to be promoted. He had 15 years with the company. After losing his job, he fell into depression, couldn't afford healthcare, and died of a heart attack 18 months later." The murmur became a buzz. Financial journalists were typing furiously. "Today, I want to talk about a different kind of return on investment. The return on human investment. The dividends of dignity. The compound interest of compassion." Alexander clicked to his first slide. The Pierce Tech Responsibility Initiative. Effective immediately, Pierce Tech will implement the most comprehensive employee welfare program in corporate America. We will rehire and retrain every qualified worker laid off in the past 3 years. We will expand healthcare coverage to include mental health services and dependent care for all employees. David Jensen was on his feet. "Mr. Pierce, what is the projected cost of these initiatives?" $200 million in year 1, Alexander said without hesitation. $400 million over 5 years. The ballroom erupted. Shouted questions, angry voices, the scraping of chairs as people stood to leave. Alexander continued speaking over the chaos. "We will implement profit sharing for all employees earning under $60,000 annually. We will establish a fund to provide financial and mental health support for workers affected by corporate restructuring. We will prioritize human stability over stock volatility." "This is madness," someone shouted from the back. "This is accountability." Alexander replied. The presentation lasted 23 minutes. By the time Alexander finished, half the room had walked out, and the other half was in open revolt. Stock futures were already dropping on the trading floor. Blackwood approached the stage with the other board members, their faces masks of fury and disbelief. Alexander, Blackwood said quietly. You're done. Alexander nodded. I know. Clean out your office. Security will escort you. This company cannot survive this kind of idealism. As Alexander left the stage, reporters swarmed him with questions. How would shareholders react? Was this a publicity stunt? Had he suffered some kind of breakdown? Alexander pushed through them without comment, thinking only of a little girl who'd forgiven a ghost she thought was her father. His last official act as CEO took place in the legal department at 2 a.m. Monica found him there, surrounded by trust documents and beneficiary forms. Sir, I heard about the presentation. I'm so sorry. Alexander didn't look up from the papers he was signing. Monica, I need you to establish an educational trust. $5 million, anonymously donated to cover medical expenses and future education for Janie Davis. Sir, that's a significant personal expenditure. The most important investment I've ever made. Alexander sealed the documents in an envelope. Make sure it goes through proper legal channels. No publicity, no corporate involvement. Just a trust fund from an anonymous benefactor. Monica took the envelope with trembling hands. What will you do now? Alexander walked to the window overlooking Chicago. Somewhere out there, Janie was sleeping in her hospital bed, probably dreaming of astronauts and distant planets. Somewhere else, other children were facing battles that no amount of money could solve, but that human presence might make bearable. I'm going to learn how to be useful, he said. By morning, the financial news channels were calling it the Pierce meltdown. Pierce Tech stock had dropped 18%. The board had voted unanimously to remove Alexander from all positions. Industry analysts predicted the company would abandon his initiatives within 6 months. Alexander watched the coverage from his empty office as security waited to escort him out. For the first time in 20 years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: peace. 6 months later, Alexander Pierce was just Alex to everyone at Riverside Children's Hospital. He arrived every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 a.m., wearing jeans and a simple polo shirt instead of his old $1,000 suits, carrying a canvas bag filled with books and art supplies. The transformation hadn't been immediate. Those first weeks after losing Pierce Tech had been dark, reporters camping outside his penthouse, former colleagues avoiding his calls, the crushing weight of wondering if he'd destroyed everything for nothing. But somewhere between learning to operate the industrial dishwasher in the hospital kitchen and mastering the art of making paper airplanes, Alexander had discovered something unexpected. He was happier than he'd been in 20 years. Morning, Alex, called Maria, the head nurse, as he signed in at the volunteer desk. Janie's been asking about you since yesterday. She finished the space book you brought last week. Alexander smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that came with being needed for something other than quarterly projections. I brought 3 new ones. Carl Sagan this time. Figured she's ready for the real stuff. The pediatric wing had become as familiar to him as his old executive suite once was. He knew which floor tiles squeaked, which vending machine ate quarters, and exactly how to make the ancient coffee maker produce something almost drinkable. More importantly, he knew the kids, their names, their stories, their fears and hopes. Tommy in 304 was obsessed with dinosaurs and told elaborate stories about time travel. Maya in 307 drew portraits of her doctors with careful attention to making them look heroic. Ben in 315 was learning chess and beat Alexander 3 games out of 5 last week. And then there was Janie. She was in the sunroom today, the glass-walled space that caught the morning light and made everything feel possible. Her hair had grown back in soft curls, and the 4-pole that had once followed her everywhere was gone. Dr. Torres said her latest tests showed continued improvement, the leukemia retreating, her body winning a battle that had seemed impossible 6 months ago. Daddy! She looked up from the puzzle spread across the low table, her face bright with joy. Look, I almost finished the whole galaxy. Alexander knelt beside her, studying the 1,000-piece image of the Andromeda Galaxy. She'd been working on it for weeks, her small fingers patient with the intricate pieces that would have frustrated most adults. That's incredible, Janie. Your father would be so proud. She beamed at the praise, then grew thoughtful. Do you think he knows about me getting better? I think, Alexander said carefully, that love doesn't end just because someone goes away. The people who care about us carry a piece of that love forward. Janie considered this with the seriousness she brought to all their conversations. Mrs. Rose says that too. She says Daddy lives in here now. She pressed her small hand to her chest. And in here. She touched her temple. But I still like it when you visit. It feels like he's close. Alexander's throat tightened. In all these months, no one had told Janie the truth about who he really was. Dr. Torres had consulted child psychologists, who recommended letting her maintain the connection that seemed to comfort her so much, especially as she fought for her life. Alexander had never corrected her, couldn't bear to take away something that brought her peace. Come on, he said, standing and offering his hand. Let's go read by the window. I brought that book about black holes you wanted. They settled into the wide window seat that overlooked the hospital garden. Outside, October rain drummed against the glass, turning the world gray and soft. Janie curled up beside him, her head resting against his shoulder as he opened the book. Chapter 1, The Heart of Darkness. He began reading. A black hole is not a hole at all, but a region of space where gravity has become so strong. As he read, Alexander became aware of Janie's breathing growing slower, more peaceful. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the window, and somewhere down the hall, he could hear the distant sounds of the hospital, monitors beeping, nurses talking quietly, the ordinary symphony of healing. Daddy? Janie's voice was barely a whisper. Yes? You came back again. Alexander's vision blurred as tears he'd been holding back for months finally fell. He continued reading about distant stars and impossible physics, his voice steady despite the wetness on his cheeks. Through the rain-streaked window, he could see his reflection, no longer the sharp-suited executive who'd once commanded boardrooms and intimidated competitors. Just a man reading to a child, learning that the most profound transformations happen not in conference rooms, but in quiet moments of connection. Janie's trust fund remained anonymous, administered by lawyers who would ensure her education through graduate school. Pierce Tech had indeed abandoned most of his initiatives, though the employee mental health program survived in a reduced form. The company's stock had recovered, Alexander's had not. And he'd never been more grateful for anything in his life. Outside, the rain began to ease, and a shaft of afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, warming the window where a broken seal and a healing child shared stories about the infinite mystery of space.